discussing new research in Canadian environmental history.
So I think it shows that we can never know everything about the past, and we may not ever be able to recover more than the barest glimmerings of these kinds of exchanges in lives.
I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 60 of Nature's Past, podcast of the Network in Canadian History and Environment. From time to time, we like to draw your attention to new research in the field of Canadian environmental history. We interview authors about new books. We speak with graduate students about their dissertations and theses. On this episode of the podcast, we want to focus on new book chapters and journal articles. There are dozens of fascinating articles and book chapters in Canadian environmental history that come out every year. Niche and the University of Calgary Press publish a series of edited collections called Canadian History and Environment, and Niche itself now has its own research paper series called Papers in Canadian History and Environment. But even more research appears in the pages of other journals and books. To draw some attention to this work, I sat down with two Niche editors, Tina Adcock from Simon Fraser University and Claire Campbell from Bucknell University. We discussed new articles and book chapters in Canadian environmental history. We each selected one article or book chapter that we had read recently and asked the others to read it too, and then got together to talk more about our selections. So we decided to select some new articles and book chapters in Canadian environmental history. I asked Tina Adcock from Simon Fraser University and Claire Campbell from Bucknell University to pick a new book chapter or journal article that they had read recently, and then bring it to the roundtable here for all of us to discuss. And I'm joined here today by Tina Adcock. Hi, Tina.
Hi.
And Claire Campbell. Hello, Claire.
Hello, everyone.
So the three of us are here to discuss three new journal articles or book chapters in Canadian environmental history. And I thought I'd ask Tina to lead us off with her pick for the discussion.
Thanks, Sean. So I have selected an article by Tina Liu entitled Political Animals, Barren Ground Caribou and the Managers in a Post-Normal Age. And this was published in the journal Environmental History in 2017. So this is a case study of barren ground caribou conservation in the Canadian North from the 1940s to the 1980s. Liu focuses especially on the 1970s and the 1980s, which she notes is a period not much considered by historians interested in wildlife conservation in the Canadian North. In contradistinction to previous scholars who have emphasized the strong colonial and ideological nature of mid-20th century caribou conservation, Liu really stresses the uncertainty that attended the management of these animals. So she characterizes caribou conservation during this era as a post-normal or a crisis science, which is a kind of practice that emerges when facts are in doubt, values are in conflict, the stakes are high, and the need for action is urgent. So faced with what has often been termed the caribou crisis of the 1950s and 1960s, or a perceived rapid drop in caribou numbers that seemed to herald extinction, scientists became concerned about this population's survival and aware that they needed more and better information about these animals. After 1970, wildlife biologists took the unusual step of extending their scientific peer community, of asking Northern Indigenous peoples for more information. They soon realized that in order to do so, however, they had to build a sense of trust between these two communities, between scientists and Indigenous users of caribou. So enter Donald Snowden and the Kaminariak Caribou Herd Video Project. Through talking about caribou on camera, biologists and Inuit found some common ground. They came to understand the value of each other's differently situated knowledge about these animals. This newfound respect and trust was an important precondition for the creation of the Beverly and Kaminariak Caribou Management Board in 1982. On which Inuit, as well as Kabluunat, or white people, sat. So Liu argues that the formation of this Caribou Management Board marked an important moment in the history of conservation, when users of a resource and their knowledge were made part of wildlife science and management. And although management boards have been critiqued as neo-colonial, Liu finds that this board also enabled Indigenous knowledge to shape the ways that scientists studied and managed caribou. So for instance, scientists agreed not to tag caribou without Inuit approval, as Inuit knew that this practice of tagging was harmful and disrespectful to the animals. So since the 1980s, even as scientists have continued to negotiate the use of certain management practices like tagging with users, scientists have also become more willing to trust Indigenous knowledge about caribou and to act on it, even if they lack scientific data to back up those actions. So that's a brief summary of Liu's article. Why did I choose this piece? Why did I find it noteworthy? So first, it exemplifies an exciting trend in environmental history, or at least one that I find exciting, which is the field's multiplying points of convergence with the history of science and technology, and with science and technology studies. So in her abstract, Liu explicitly terms this case study an important moment in the history of science. And other scholars like Michael Egan have also used the similar ideas as Liu pursues in this article, so the ideas of post-normal science and crisis disciplines, recently to study environmental issues in the 1970s. So this is perhaps sort of indicative of a wider turn. Second of all, I like this article because it features that rarest of things in Canadian environmental history, a case study that more than one scholar has worked on, and that has subsequently become a locus for historiographical discussion and debate. As Sean and Claire well know, and as many listeners will know, Canadian environmental history tends to be extensive rather than intensive. We politely eschew each other's intellectual territories in favor of unoccupied ground. But the caribou crisis by now actually has a substantial body of work attached to it. So if you wanted to, as an instructor, you could actually fashion a historiographical assignment by pairing Liu's article with work by John Sandlos or Peter Usher or Peter Kolchiski and Frank Tester. And third, I always like to feature Tina's work in my classes because I really appreciate her commitment to writing in a style that is clear to students as well as to more senior scholars. So I actually assigned this article in a 400 level seminar this term. Students really enjoyed it and they were able to engage with its arguments fairly well. So those are my comments. I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Well, I think you're spot on with your remarks at the end about the rarity of finding scholarship in Canadian environmental history where you can present students with a historiographic debate. So the thing that has struck me about this article is how will other scholars who have researched in this area react to Liu's arguments, and in particular, the kind of hopefulness of the tone of the piece, and the way that she contrasts that against scholarship on the pre-1970s period. Claire, I don't know what you thought about that, like the relationship between existing scholarship and this new article.
That was exactly my sense of it, Sean. One of the things I really liked about this story is what she refers to as scientific humility, and also this general sensibility of willingness to participate on all sides, a willingness to adapt, and a willingness to contribute, so that you felt like by the end of the story, we had actually we'd all learned something. We'd all gotten somewhere new. And I thought that was a really positive lesson, and also a really encouraging statement about the arc of science and also settler-Indigenous relations in recent decades.
Tina, do you worry that it's too optimistic in its view? I mean, one thing that stands out to me is the, not severity of the contrast, but there is a contrast between, I think, the arguments that Sandlos makes in his book on wildlife management in the Northwest Territories and the history that Liu presents here for the post-1970 period. I don't get a clear sense of where this transition happens from a colonial regime that is suppressing Indigenous sovereignty to one that is creating an integrated settler and Indigenous new kind of science and wildlife management in the North.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, and as you know, Tina has sort of really featured hope as a kind of architecture or sort of concept in some of her other pieces related to this time and place. I actually didn't read this article sort of as presenting a set of rose-tinted glasses, maybe quite as much as you did. I think Tina's point, in part, is that the way that the caribou crisis and sort of colonial management of wildlife has been presented, particularly in the sort of early to mid 20th century, it's been presented with quite a strong, what I might call a strong colonial cast, sort of a strong sense of colonialism. And so I don't think she's so much arguing that, we transition to a kind of we transition to a place where there is no colonialism or anything, and I don't think that either of you were sort of saying that. But what I do think she's saying is she's complicating the story, basically. So when I read her comments about the uncertainty of the scientists like Kelsall and Banfield in the 1950s and 1960s, I read this as akin to critical work on colonialism that basically points to the cracks in the colonial facade, right? The cracks in the architecture that open up spaces for different kinds of action and different kinds of collaboration.
And certainly the Indigenous, I mean, she's providing a backdrop too of court litigation and organization and overt critique of scientific practice among Indigenous peoples. So it isn't sort of, again, a sort of a Teletubbies moment or anything. And I just remember thinking too that there was this, I kept thinking that there was an analogy to recent embracing of quote unquote citizen science, but could we really characterize this as proto-citizen science when knowing that there is this entire other political cast to the particular relationship between Indigenous peoples in the North and settlers and Southerners? Whether this felt like an early version of that or not.
Now, Tina, your own work on the North deals with an earlier period, but you do work that looks at these intersections between history of science and environmental history. What do you see that scholars can maybe take from Lou's approach here to continuing to think about post-normal science in the post-1970 period in Canada?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that sort of what I think on this question has so much to do with sort of applying post-normal science to the post-1970 period, so much as kind of a larger willingness to take insights from science and technology studies and the history of science and to see whether they fit Canadian case studies, to see whether they help us see dimensions of historical experience that perhaps were not quite as clear without applying that lens. And I think that's what Lou has done really effectively here, is that she's sort of taken a concept that actually helps us see a richer, sort of more complex story of caribou conservation, especially post 1970, and has really sort of made what I think is a fairly strong and convincing, but also quite nuanced and complicated case. So, and other scholars like Dolly Jorgensen have argued that environmental historians should be more willing to consider, pulling tools from the science and technology studies toolkit. So I think, Tina's article really shows a fairly convincing example of how one could do that.
Yeah, I could see another teaching module with Lou's article and a couple of other examples of environmental historians pulling from the science and technology studies toolkit and comparing how environmental historians have approached this.
Could I ask a question? In light of our ongoing conversation about presentism and the moving forward and back in historical lessons, right? As environmental historians, we're always asked, well, what's going to happen next? What do you see in the next? What do you see in the next 100 years? I was reading this and I was thinking about the discussion over climate change, and I was wondering whether you two saw an analogy or an application to discussions about climate change and Inuit knowledge thereof, or whether do you think that Lou was sort of very carefully staying away from drawing parallels into, say, the 1990s and the aughts.
I mean, she's not explicit in the article, so I could certainly see, outside analysis making those connections, or maybe adopting the approach that Lou takes in this article and applying it to histories of climate science in the Arctic, for example, in the 1990s. If there are examples of a kind of citizen science or integration of climate science with Indigenous knowledge among the Inuit in the North, I could see being able to draw from Lou's work here. How far you could go with that, though, is interesting. Are there direct connections between the wildlife science that took place in the 1980s and the climate science that took place later?
That is a really interesting question. And of course, there is a whole literature on sort of climate change, climate science, and sort of basically the applications of traditional ecological knowledge or IQ. Actually, fun fact about IQ, which is sort of Inuit traditional knowledge. So Lou gives the full name in Inuktitut on page 452 of the article. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce it, but I have heard that that Inuit basically chose a name, a title for this knowledge that was deliberately difficult for non-Inuit to pronounce. It's a really complicated word, so a little bit of subversiveness there, perhaps, in terms of choosing a title for traditional ecological knowledge in the North and in sort of Inuit territories.
So that's an excellent first pick, Tina. Thanks for finding something that has touched on some themes that we've already been looking at on the Niche website now for years. Our next pick comes from Claire, and it takes us even deeper into the past, considerably deeper into the past, into the 16th century. Claire, what was your pick?
My pick was an essay by Jack Pouchard, who is finishing up his doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh and about to begin a postdoctoral fellowship in Washington, D.C. And the essay, or the chapter, is called Gens sauvages et étranges, Amerindians and the Early Fishery in the 16th Century Gulf of St. Lawrence. I don't have anything as eloquent and as coherent as Tina in terms of my presentation of this essay. And it's also much more geared to why I chose it as opposed to the description of the essay on its own merits. But I chose it for sort of three related clusters of related reasons. Form or source, what the article actually talks about, and its use, its application. To the first point, I chose it in part in a just terribly grasping claim to self-promotion, as this is this is one of the early essays in a forthcoming collection of essays on the environmental history of the Gulf of St. Lawrence that I am co-editing with Brian Payne and Edward MacDonald, titled "The Greater Gulf," that should be out later this year. Part of the larger point about that, though, is that I think Jack is looking at a really important and re-looking at a really important area of significance for environmental history. Having moved away from Atlantic Canada, I am constantly looking for new work on Atlantic Canada, and I was really glad to see Jack working on this. And a related point, I think we need to remember that there are people outside of Canada interested in Canada. And so continuing to seek out those non-Canadians or Canadian expats in other communities of environmental history could be really useful to us. And I come across Jack's work talking about Terra Nova as a maritime space in numerous languages and literatures from different imperial powers. The understanding of the new lands of Terra Nova as islands, I find his dexterity with 16th century sources really impressive. So that was one of the reasons I nominated it. In terms of environmental history, what I really like about this piece is how Bouchard relays what I consider the real balance of environmental history, the ricocheting between environmental conditions and environmental constraints, environmental opportunities and environmental limits. And this article talks about the enormous, what he calls biological affluence of the Gulf region, but only in the context of a strict seasonal cycle from which European fishers and Indigenous peoples of the Northeast both profit, but also are constrained by. And this was very much an essay on the maritime, what he calls in this land poor but water rich region. And in this, it draws out connections or it suggests parallels to other northerly Atlantic regions. I was thinking of the maritime interests and capabilities of the Algonquian peoples and the peoples further to the south that Andrew Lippman talks about in Saltwater Frontier, for example. So that the waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence become an inflection point for commerce, connecting inland riverine routes to coastal Atlantic networks. This is very much looking at the Gulf as part of a network of waterways and a network of bodies of water. And I really appreciate that take on it from environmental history, because Atlantic historians, Atlantic and maritime environmental historians have been saying for some years now that we keep forgetting about water. And I really like the way that Jack anchors his work, so to speak, in the water. And the last point about the environmental history contribution is that he's arguing against the idea of a catastrophic moment of contact, but rather that there is a century of small-scale, maritime-based meeting places. And again, Lippman does this further south. And so what we're seeing in this era of history is, again, not a disastrous one-off moment, but a slow acculturation that produces much longer-term changes in migration and in limited understandings. And so for those three reasons, I liked it in terms of environmental history. And the last point, and this speaks to Tina's point about how to use this in our teaching, given that especially that I'm in the United States and their sense of geography into the north is limited. I found this accessible, balanced, and a good combination of an overview of grand Atlantic geography and the particulars of the Gulf, so that for students there is enough to help orient them, but also enough to help ground them. And I find that finding teaching materials that aren't so micro that students don't know where we are beginning, that's actually sometimes hard to find. And so I liked this differential scale that comes across in this article, or this essay.
Well, I really like this chapter, and I read it through my own self-interested lens in terms of what it can tell us about the history of ecological imperialism in Canada, which is an area that I've been thinking about in the recent past. And I've been wondering to what extent Piper and Sandloss's article from, I think, 2007 in Environmental History, A Broken Frontier, that attempts to describe the processes of ecological imperialism in the Canadian subarctic, and describes it as a broken frontier of islands of neo-Europes where non-Indigenous settlers transplant the plants, animals, and microbes of Eurasia into Indigenous environments and expose Indigenous people in the subarctic. And I think that their arguments can be applied beyond the geography of the subarctic. And this case study in the Gulf suggests that. It incorporates parts of the subarctic, certainly, but it incorporates some southern regions. So I totally agree. I think the most interesting argument that Jack makes in this piece is that for a century or more, the primary engagement between Indigenous people and Europeans in the what would become the east coast of Canada was a maritime engagement, was the sea rather than the land. And he effectively shows the degree to which it was non-catastrophic, as he characterizes it. We don't have evidence of major epidemics breaking out as a result of Basque whalers or fishers encountering Indigenous people. We don't have major evidence of plant transfers. There's no attempts at agricultural settlement on the part of Europeans in this area. And by and large, I think Jack is suggesting that the ecology of the Gulf is not radically transformed by contact with Europe.
It's imperial without being invasive, right? And it's kind of I wouldn't put it on quite the same footing as the humility that we talked about in the first example, but it's a good reminder of just where the balance of power lay. And with one of the things that draws our attention to is that both Indigenous and European groups retreated from the water in the winter, right? Because there wasn't the biomass for support. And so for me, it was a good complement, if you like, to the other material on biological imperialism.
Yeah. And I guess another thing for me as a Canadian historian is a reminder about the scales of time that we need to think about when we're looking at early modern history in North America. This is a period that I think in Canadian history textbooks and in our broader narratives about Canadian history gets skipped over or is covered rather quickly and becomes easy to forget that we're talking about more than a century of time between Cabot's voyage and the French settlements in Acadia and Quebec. And that there's a considerable period of interaction between Europeans and Indigenous people that goes on that informs subsequent French colonialism in North America.
For sure. I might just pick up on that point, Sean. I think, and Claire's point about kind of how one could use this article in the classroom, I think another really positive versus beneficial thing about this article from a teaching standpoint is that it really clearly lays out the methodological challenges of studying this time and place and of kind of reconstructing historical experience and interaction. Jack lays out the fact that there has been archival degradation of sources that has led to sort of the obscurity of people's actions. He lays out the fact that, early fishermen didn't leave many records of these kinds of exchanges or things like that. He lays out how archaeologists have difficulty distinguishing 16th century sites around the Gulf from sort of earlier periods. So I think that it really shows students sort of the issues that come with the kind of reconstruction of case studies in this time and place. So I think that also would make it a sort of good article for teaching. And I think it also gestures to the limits of what we can know about the past in a sort of really useful way. So when I was reading Jack's comment about sort of the countless meetings and exchanges and clashes between different communities of Amerindians and fishermen, and how he says that actually the majority of these moments are lost, it reminded me of a comment made by the Welcome to Night Vale podcast, which I really like. So the quote runs, "On this day in history, people who have since been forgotten created things that will never be found nor understood." And so that's what I thought of, so I think it shows that we can never know everything about the past, and we may not ever be able to recover more than the barest glimmerings of these kinds of exchanges and lives. I guess the last thing I just wanted to say on this point too is that, like Sean, I found much of interest and value in this piece. But I wondered how I might incorporate this material into lectures, for example, into my early modern section of my course on Canadian environmental history. And I say this because I think it can sometimes be difficult to incorporate what I think of as stories in a quieter key, or material from narratives of less dramatic change over time. I mean, how do we incorporate material like this in ways that students find compelling or even just easy to grasp? There's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of shades of gray. And so, well, I agree, Claire, that I think in some respects this is ideally suited as a reading in the classroom. In other respects, I just wonder if students might just think, well, what was the point of reading that? There's no kind of grand, exciting stories of change here. Really, it's all a little muted in some ways.
I guess pedagogically, the value I see out of this is the methodological discussion about how to read a small body of sources and draw inferences from those sources. So I do an exercise in my intro Canadian history class where we look at some passages from Cartier's journal from his first voyage in the 1530s, and a particular encounter that he has with a group of Indigenous people, Algonquian Indigenous people who he encounters in the Bay of Chaleur, who start chasing him in a canoe. and he and his compatriots try to flee, but eventually they get caught, and they all land on a beach, and the indigenous people were waving skins and furs at them on the ends of sticks, and indicating that they wanted to trade. So I use this in my class to get students to answer questions about what we can know about the relationship between indigenous people and Europeans from this. And this is a really clear-cut example of something Jack shows quite a bit in this chapter, which is evidence of pre-existing trade relationships. So there would be no reason why indigenous people would immediately assume that they could trade with Cartier if they hadn't already traded with Europeans before the 1530s. And Jack does a lot of this in the chapter where he makes inferences about long time existing relationships from descriptions of those relationships many years later.
And I mean, that's a great question, Tina. And the two things that come to mind, one, when last semester in my 18th century class, I taught George Colpett's article From Powering Up on the food of the fur trade. And the students got amazingly into it. And I think seeing this as a map of biomass under exchange, biomass under harvest, patterns of migration based on where your food source is and what those food sources are. I think that might be a point of entry for some students, the whole question of why fish in the first place, right? I think that might be a point of entry. And the second thing is looking ahead. One of the things that struck me about Sean's choice, not to give anything away, but something that a phrase that comes up in the last article is the idea of dappled geographies and ecotones, transitional spaces. And we're so used to thinking, I think, of Canada as kind of these eco blocks, right? You go into the boreal forest, you go into the Arctic, thinking about how much Canadian history might have happened on the water. And what does that mean for our sense of littoral, for sense of shoreline? When we talk about early French settlement and we talk about marshlands, right? These are geographies that are exotic and unfamiliar to students of the 21st century, and getting them to reposition or reorient themselves that way might help. But you're right. The ironic twist is that rather than a dramatic story, he's emphasizing in some ways some history may be cumulative, right? And quiet. Yeah.
Well, Claire, you didn't spoil too much for my pick, but you did set up a nice segue to the article that I picked for this discussion, and it picks up and complements really nicely with Bouchard's piece. And this is an article by Chris Parsons, which was published in Environmental History last year in 2017, called Wildness Without Wilderness, Biogeography and Empire in 17th Century French North America. So Chris's article covers some of the same geography as Jack's, but a century later. And in this article, Chris challenges, I think, some of the broader meta-narratives of North American environmental history that have framed a kind of binary intellectual relationship between the idea of wilderness and the idea of civilization. One that Chris, I think, implies in this article is an Anglo-centric view of Europe's conquest of North America. And he invites scholars to think about an alternative encounter between Europeans and North American environments in the context of French North America, among a colonizing power that didn't have a language or a term that was analogous to wilderness. So Parsons' argument here is historical and linguistic to some extent, to try and understand how French colonizers in the 17th century conceptualized North American environments in the absence of a concept of wilderness. And instead, he looks at this concept of the sauvage, a more complicated term that perhaps is closer to wildness, but one that doesn't separate or doesn't, as he says, dismember the world into binaries: civilization, opposite wilderness, Christian or pagan, European versus Native American. Instead, reading French sources, including the accounts of Champlain, Jesuit relations, and other records, he finds French colonizers describing the sauvage as a redeemable nature, particularly the flora and the landscape as wild until such time as it can be tamed by cultivation and the civilizing processes of French settlement. And some of these ideas, Parsons alludes to being applicable to French thought about Indigenous people as well, that Indigenous people would be integrated, assimilated into French North American society by the same processes that North American nature would be integrated and assimilated into French society. So he uses mostly botanical examples. The establishment of gardens in early settlements in Acadia and at Quebec, and the integration of North American and European plants into those gardens as evidence of a kind of, I don't know what you call it, redemptive gardening for the North American environment to try and tame these wild plants. It's a really interesting case study here, and I selected it because I think it's the kind of reading that opens up big discussions about North American environmental history and attempts to challenge some of the existing scholarship. So again, from a teaching perspective, it's the kind of article that you could assign alongside articles on early settlement in New England. I think a little bit about Virginia DeJohn Anderson's book on livestock in New England in the same period. And it's an opportunity for students to debate these competing ideas. Is there a significant intellectual difference between French colonization of northern North America and English colonization to the south? There are pieces missing, though, I think, in this article. And in particular, what's missing is the livestock animals. Parsons is explicit that he's looking at plants and land and people to a lesser extent. But I don't know if the actors at the time separated the world in that way, particularly when it came to agriculture. French farmers and English farmers practiced similar forms of mixed husbandry, and the use of domestic animals in agriculture in France and England wouldn't have been that radically different. The absence of livestock animals is apparent in the records of Champlain and in the Jesuit relations, and there's commentary on this. It could perhaps be reinforcing for the argument that this is a land that needs a kind of taming, and the introduction of livestock animals could be part of it. But I think the reason why they're missing is that livestock animals were very difficult to establish in the 17th century in Acadia and at Quebec. And it's not really until the 18th century that substantial numbers of livestock are transferred to North America and can propagate in a sustaining fashion. And it's one of the most substantial ecological differences between the French colonies and the colonies of New England. And one of the reasons why a book like Anderson's that looks at the overrunning of the land by livestock animals, or a book like Eleanor Melville's A Plague of Sheep, simply couldn't be written for New France, because there never was a plague of sheep in New France, and there never was a plague of cattle. Instead, if you look at the work of Cole Harris, Graham Wynne, and others, livestock animals in Quebec and the Maritimes were small in population and didn't fare very well when they ran loose. They tended to vanish, die, and disappear in a harsher environment than they encountered in New England or in Mexico. So those are some of my thoughts on this piece. I think there's a lot more to be said about it, but I wonder what the two of you thought.
Well, that's really interesting, Sean, mostly because I didn't know any of that. But because I was reading the emphasis on plants, especially sort of flowering and fruitful plants, as because of Parsons' sort of wonderful return to linguistic analysis. I was reading it much more in a metaphorical sense, that plants that were Edenic, or much more of a garden, that were sort of placid and stable and quasi-ornamental, and all those things that frankly cattle in large numbers are not. And so I was reading, I thought it was much more sort of a factor of the interpretation and the record keeping, and it hadn't dawned on me that there was in fact a very pragmatic and ecological reality to the emphasis on fruit and nut bearing trees.
I mean, I guess I'd be interested to know from the same sources what French colonists said about wild animals. They hunted and they relied on indigenous people to hunt those animals for them. And in many cases, certainly in the first half century of these settlements, they were, in some cases, utterly dependent on those wild animals for their survival and indigenous people's skills hunting those wild animals. Parsons talks a little bit about the similarities between Northern European wild animals and Northern North American wild animals in the 17th century. And he draws from other work that has found this to be the case. So there wouldn't have been the kind of extraordinary descriptions of bizarre wild animals that Spanish colonists found in the Caribbean or in South America. But I would be curious how wild animals fit into this idea of the sauvage.
So one thing, just picking up on that point from a different angle, Sean, this article reminded me of a lot of different things. And so I found Parsons' choice to translate sauvage as wild and his application of that term to both people and plants in 17th century North America actually reminded me of Etienne Benson's piece from the Wildlife in America Forum in Environmental History back in 2011, I think. So Benson's piece talked about the distinction between wildlife, 2 words, and wildlife, 1 word, in late 19th and early 20th century America. So Benson explains that the term was originally applied to both humans and animals. So to any being, in other words, who worked or played in a manner or a style that was not civilized. So it strikes me that wildlife, 2 words, like sauvage, smudged rather than reified the divide between human and non-human worlds and experiences. So, I mean, there's an animal example for you, Sean, although it comes from kind of a different place and line of thought. But I did find the similarity between the 2 arguments striking.
The other historiographical literature that I thought of was the work coming out by people like Sam White and Dagmar de Groot about the surprise at finding that latitudinal lines did not equal climactic similarities, right? And that which could be planted is, because that's one thing I really loved about this article was the very accessible rendering of deep time in terms of what some of the original geologies and original climates may have been, linking the Northwest European section to the Northeast North American continent, and how those had diverged over time, and for the divergence for which early European explorers and settlers were fundamentally unprepared. And so I found myself thinking of that literature on climate history, which overlaps very much with this period.
Yeah, my last thought on this piece, I mean, first of all, I have sort of selfish intentions for picking this one because I used to teach a course on Europe's conquest of North America, an environmental history course. And so this is the kind of article that, a few years ago, I absolutely wish I had because the research just hadn't been done until Parsons published this. So this is great. It'll show up in a syllabus in the future for me. I wonder how long this argument that Parsons has here can be sustained. Is it something that can only be applied to the 17th century, or does this idea of the redeemable wild persist into the 18th century? Part of me thinks no, that as the French settlements grew in size and as you move beyond simply being experimental fortifications with some missionaries doing work in North America to actual agricultural settlements, modest agricultural settlements, if the binary between civilization and wilderness became sharper. I think there's probably evidence of that in the 18th century in Quebec. Certainly, the French settlements were palisaded, fortified settlements, hardly integrated into their surrounding environments. Whenever I show my students population maps of 18th century North America, the French settlements are these tiny little dots just in a sea of indigenous people and environment that they hardly ever encountered. So it would be hard, I think, to sustain the case that the North American environment to French colonists was something they sought to redeem or save. By the 18th century, they were surrounding themselves with walls to try and keep it out as much as possible.
It might also depend on whether I think you'd want to stay true to Parsons' philosophy. You'd also want to track contextual use of the word, right? Or meanings of the word, to see whether those changed as well.
Yes, especially as the word was applied to Indigenous people, as the intensification of conflict with the Haudenosaunee into the 18th century led to raids and attacks on French colonists. I wonder whether the meaning of sauvage changed. Well, I want to thank the two of you for your excellent picks. Listeners can find the bibliographic references for the articles and book chapter that we discussed here, as well as links for how to access them, except, of course, for Bouchard's, which will be in a forthcoming book. So keep an eye out for that. I want to thank Claire and Tina so much for joining us. Nature's Past is produced with support from the Network in Canadian History and Environment. This episode was made by Tina Adcock, Claire Campbell, and me, Sean Courage. Music for Nature's Past was licensed by Creative Commons. For details on the artists, please take a look at our show notes at niche-canada.org/naturespast, where you can also download new episodes, subscribe to the podcast with any podcast player, and leave comments. You can also follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/naturespast. You can always find out more about the environmental history research community in Canada from the Niche website at niche-canada.org. And you can find out more about the topics we discussed on this episode on our show notes page. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Nature's Past.